American, and tonight I kind of touched a little bit, quoting Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz regarding Native peoples. I pointed out last night that we call them Native Americans in the States, not First Nations, because for us to start referring to them as nations would open a whole new can of worms that we're not ready to deal with yet. But right now what I want to do is I just want to take a moment to, how shall I say this? Okay, so I'm going to quote one of the would-be presidential candidates. In the first debate, there was a question about immigration. And this candidate replied, after we seal the borders, and it's not Donald Trump, after we seal the borders, after we turn off the spigot that dispenses all the goodies, people who had a pristine record, we should consider allowing them to become guest workers primarily in the agricultural sphere. And I thought, that's the worst thing I've heard since slavery, Dr. Carson. And the reason I use his example is because last night you mentioned, why don't I just call it white supremacy instead of Western supremacy? And it's because there are people of color who buy into the oppressive system that that divides people. And he is a good example of this. He is one who, as an African American, seems to be very taken by a particular subset of our population that basically denies his own heritage, his own narrative. But this happens with all kinds of people. This happens with African Americans, it happens with Latinos, it happens with gays. Maybe sometimes happens more with gays, I think, because they try harder to, right? The ones that are hypocritical, right? They try harder to you know, like I have a wide stance. You don't know that one, do you? Okay. Because there are people who preach harder in certain political circles against it when they themselves are gay, right? And it causes me to wonder sometimes. I mean, I'm not trying to, but if I hear you talking too homophobically, I'm just like, is there more to this story? Yeah, so this happens, like I said, with African Americans. But the thing that I wanted this to lead to was how clueless, how obtuse people are when it comes to our history. Because we want to reject people, you know, half of the immigrants in the United States, half of undocumented, unauthorized immigrants are Mexican. We don't know our own history. We don't realize that most of the places they're going to were actually once part of Mexico. And as a reference, I want to just recommend a book. I think it's the next slide. Now, that title might sound like somebody subversive, but that title is actually a quote from one of the American presidents of the era, who recognized that the United States took up arms against Mexico. You know, most Americans don't know that the United States occupied Mexico all the way almost to the southern tip of Mexico and took over Mexico City during this war. And Congress debated whether we should just take over Mexico, because Manifest Destiny said that the North American continent belonged to us. Everything except for Canada, at least. Except for now. Yeah.
We went to Washington and we burned the White House.
Exactly. So this is why I think that the states decided, well, you know, we don't want Canada. But we want, you know, we want the whole continent going westward, and we want it going southward. And Congress debated this intensely for some time, and they decided, well, we won't take all of Mexico, but we will take what now today amounts to Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and California.
Texas had previously been
A little earlier. Yeah. Texas a little bit earlier on. When I hear people talk like this, what I think we need perhaps is not so much immigration reform, but human reform. I want to go from there to, there's something, you might not have heard of Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He served in the cabinet of both Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and then after that, Nixon and Ford. He was a 3-time U.S. Senator, but while he was working for John F. Kennedy, he was commissioned to do a study. To this day is often referenced, called the Moynihan Report. And it's many pages long. I'm just going to read one really short portion of a paragraph. I don't know if this might be on, yeah, this is the next slide, in fact. This was one of his conclusions. If it will move. Yeah, that's it. Okay. That the Negro American has survived it all is extraordinary. A lesser people might simply have died out, as indeed others have. Next. But it may not be supposed that the Negro American community has not paid a fearful price for the incredible mistreatment to which it has been subjected over the past 3 centuries. I, for one, think that that major element that is unaddressed in the Moynihan Report is our faith in God. And I want to just take a moment and touch on some of the good and the bad about our faith in God. We even have a song. We've come this far by faith, leaning on the Lord, trusting in His holy word. He never failed us ever. And then there's this other song, my soul looked back and wonder how I got over. My ancestors recognized that their Jesus was not this strange Jesus of wealth, political power, and access. Our ancestors knew how not to trust in earthly powers and sources. They knew how to reach for someone higher, to feel for something beyond, and to find it, the otherworldly, the divine, as evidenced in one of the songs that the slaves often sang. Went down in the valley and I didn't plan to stay. My soul got happy and I stayed all day. There's just something about the love of Jesus makes me feel good, good, good. Jordan River is chilly and cold. It chills my body but not my soul. There's just something about the love of Jesus makes me feel good, good, good. If you don't believe I've been redeemed, just follow me down to the Jordan stream. There's something about the love of Jesus makes me feel good, good, good. And so they found a place in the gospel for their African worship styles. And they found faith in a deity that sided with no nation, least of all the United States of America. And if God sided with anybody, God was their God, because God was loving and just. He was the God of Isaiah, the high and lofty one who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy, who declared, I will dwell in the high and holy place with him who has a contrite heart and a humble spirit, to revive the spirit of the broken and to revive the heart of the contrite ones. The best of our faith tradition is found, first of all, in our sense of community. Unlike the Mexican American community, among which I live to a great extent, and we admire them for their family solidarity, particularly both the nuclear and the extended family. Our families were pillaged and ripped apart. Our women were routinely raped. I exist on this continent because I can trace my ancestry, our family tree, to a man whose name we know, who raped the woman who was African in his house. That's our beginning on this continent. And pretty much anybody who is African American, anybody of African ancestry who has been here for many generations has plenty of white blood in them, voluntary or not. And so the church compensated for this lack of family, for the arbitrary tearing apart of our families through slavery. So church has held in our economy a place that perhaps it hasn't held in many. I liken it to what happens in the temple for Jewish people. The church was family. The church was everything. When I grew up, church was family. I learned how to tie my shoes because Sister Maxine Maxwell taught me class number 6 when I was 4 years old, because my mom already had 2 more kids. My dad was overseas, and my aunt, because we didn't have relatives around us because of the military, we lived away from the family. And so my Aunt Maisie was way too impatient to, we didn't even want her trying to teach us how to tie our shoes. So church became everything. It was where we had our plays, our musicals, our concerts. It was our restaurants, because we could not go to restaurants. We could not go. My parents, the reason my dad moved from North Carolina is because where other people could go in the front door and sit down and eat, he could only order from the back door and take it home. And he didn't want his kids growing up in that environment. So the church became everything. It became our restaurant. You know, we couldn't go to bowling alleys, things like that in that era. And even hospitals were segregated. And if they weren't segregated, they were completely off limits to people of color. We experienced this firsthand when, as Californians, as kids, little kids growing up, I was 3 and my sister was 1, and my parents were taking us to be with their parents on the East Coast, 3,000 miles away. And my dad got sleepy, my mom drove, and then she got sleepy, and she totaled the car. I still have the image in my head of the upside down car and the wheels turning. And my dad reaching in the car with blood over one side of his face, reaching in to grab me and to pull me out of the car. And then we're sitting there on the side of the road, and an ambulance comes, but cannot take us to the hospital because there are no black hospitals in the area. This was in Arkansas, not far from Little Rock. And so my dad tells us of how grateful he is, because the ambulance took us to a bed and breakfast operated by a black woman, and she had the grace to not charge him to stay there for a few days while we recovered. And thankfully, I mean, there was a doctor that came over, but thankfully that our injuries weren't so severe that we needed to be in an actual hospital. But the church was our hospital. And if anybody believed in healing in those days, it was us. If anybody prayed for healing, it was there in the black church community. So in the black church because it was our everything, we celebrated with whatever anybody's triumph was, and we grieved with everybody's sorrow. We were intimate with one another. And what that looks like, what I mean by that is that, and this still happens even though the church, even though African Americans are not the underclass that we have been in every community, and not all of our churches, like my congregation, are black congregations. They're diverse, but we still carry on some of the practices. And what I mean by that is that we want to know what's going on. I know that Peter does this. This is a big deal in our life. Everything that's going on, we want everybody to know. Okay? So-and-so's getting married, we want everybody to know. Somebody got married, we want everybody to know. When June comes around and people are graduating from kindergarten, we bring all the kindergartners up And we know that they were recognized at school, but we give them certificates. And when all the middle schoolers graduate and go into high school, we know that they were recognized at school, but we bring them up to the front and we recognize them at church. And when you graduate from high school, yeah, you had your graduation at school, but you're going to have one right here at church. And then when you graduate from college, because that historically has been such a rare thing, we really make a big deal about that. And if you get a master's degree or you get a PhD, we will practically dedicate the service to you because this is such a big deal. And it doesn't have to be that. It can be a PhD or it can be a GED. Do you have GEDs?
Yeah.
Right? All right? It doesn't matter what it is. We celebrate. I don't know how many people do this, but if someone in the church has a baby, they don't have to cook for weeks, right? If you have a baby, people in the church bring food over your house over and over, and we have this tradition called the repast, right? Now, the word repast just means what? Just a meal, right? But when you hear the word repast in the black community, it refers specifically to the meal after the funeral. And this event is so significant that when you die, you want to make sure they have a repast, even if they don't have a funeral. Because this is a big deal, all right? And there's never not enough food, all right? The bereaved family has food that they have to put in freezers and things like that because there's so much food that's brought. And this thing goes on forever. And, in the families that do alcohol, it can really get out of hand. But here's part of the downside. Because we didn't have anything else. God was everything. Sometimes we placed unreasonable expectations on God just because He's able. I mean, we had lots of songs that talk about how able God is. He's able. But at the same time, God is able. He is not an enabler. And so what we found is that we didn't know how to interpret our experience in culture. And we had a reduced appreciation for things like medical care because it was so distant to us. Black doctors were few and far between, and so we trusted our community, and we trusted prayer, and we trusted God to the point that we almost, in many cases, we became anti-doctor. So we have songs. If you go to a black church, you might hear this sometime. We don't need no doctor. And I'm thinking, you need a doctor. And so, it becomes a little bit harder to embrace a song like that when your church actually has doctors in it, and they're sitting there, and you're singing that song. So we're going through this cultural crisis.
You've never been wrong.
Thank you. We keep going through we're going through this cultural crisis, moving out of exclusion, marginalization into some dimensions of prosperity. And it's a very difficult thing to navigate if you don't have informed people helping you guide the ship, which doesn't always happen. So sometimes not only can we be dismissive of doctors, we can be dismissive of higher education, because I mentioned this the last time I was here a year ago, or maybe the time before that. How one of the proudest moments in our family's life is that 20 years after I earned my bachelor's degree, my dad earned his. But when he was younger, he was not able to attend the University of North Carolina or North Carolina State and those schools. But he went to UC Santa Barbara after I already had a family, and our family is so proud of him for not giving up on his dream. Well, the thing is that sometimes in the black church world, we are dismissive of higher education, and we will become anti-intellectual. We will say, these smart people is, I mean, you can't be smart and believe at the same time. They are antithetical to each other. I know that that's not exclusively part of the black world, all right? So, and I know some of you here know what I'm talking about. But in the black world, it has been a deep part of our experience. And one of the ways that it shows up also is that we find ourselves being financially irresponsible because we have been told things like, these are people who have struggled for generations. So they're told that, you bring your tithes and your offerings. And in this offering tonight, this is an anointed offering. God's going to bless you 50-fold or 100-fold if you come and you bring your rent check tonight or whatever. And people are seduced into responding to that kind of thing because they don't have any other hope. Traditionally they have not any, they're thinking, it's like playing the lottery. And the ministers who are doing this are basically lottery operators taking advantage of people. And so for all of this, I have found a great treasure in life in the practice of centering prayer. Because it's in centering prayer that I really learn not to sacrifice the present for the future. It's in centering prayer that I learn to worship in the moment, which is really part of the authentic African American worship experience. It is. I mean, if you're in the best of the experience of the black church, you can participate and just be there. And time stands still. I mean, it stands still. It's like God comes in and nothing else matters. And this is a practice that I think that as we prosper, we kind of give up, we kind of forfeit. But where I do see it in our community is I see it in the immigrants and the Mexicans and the Salvadorans and the Guatemalans. I go to their church services, and because I understand Spanish, I'm okay being there, and the intensity of their worship and the liberty and the timelessness of it all is something that I yearn for. When I've been to the African continent about 14 times, and the first time I went there with my wife, we were in this gathering of about 10,000 people, and they had, we have praise and worship, right? They had a praise leader and then a worship leader, because the praise leader led for about an hour, and he was sweaty and he was exhausted, and he left the stage to change clothes while the worship leader came on to go another hour. But here's the thing. You would think, wow, that's an awfully long church service, and we haven't even got to announcements yet. But here's the thing. It was so powerful. Literally. The first 2 nights, we did this for 4 nights. The first 2 nights, Diane and I both could not participate, even though we knew some of the songs. We could not participate because it was so powerful to us. And there were moments when all I did was, I was so amazed with what was happening that I would get a chair and I would stand in it and just look at all of these people worshiping. And sometimes 100 men would come down to the front and start dancing. And they'd be dancing, in our world, women do more of the dancing, right? But the men would lead the way, and these men are dancing. And we were so, we were entranced really with what was going on, that we couldn't participate for a couple of nights. And eventually we were able to finally adapt to it. So then we come back home and we tell everybody what it's like. And we say, we got to do that. And they're going to do what? And they haven't been there. But it's not just that they haven't been there. It's just that they haven't been there. Not geographically. They haven't been through their colonial oppressive experience that is so recent. And the joy, the exuberation that they have just for having this freedom. And if there is some way I know there is some way, but we need to capture. For me, the practice is centering prayer. But we, as a Christian people, we need to recapture this idea of getting lost in the moment. Because when you're in the moment, then it's not so much about making, of finishing your series of requests that you want to make of God. It's like everything slows down and you see what God is already doing. And it's like, do you need me to participate in some way? I'm willing. Is there anything I need to say? Otherwise, I'm just going to be still and I'm going to be quiet. And He will call upon us to participate. The thing is that we don't generally know how to participate because we're so agitated and we're so busy and we're so angry and we're so worried and we're so stressed. So, I don't know if I should take a break right there. I want to say that I know a few, in my own community, I know a few of our local pastors who are white, who have been trying sincerely to understand the African American experience. And a month ago, I was sitting down with one of them, and he acknowledged over coffee to me that for one thing, it's just, he just said, it's too painful to think about what our country has done to African Americans and continues to do, and how much is owed. It's just too much to think about. And I don't even know if he knows really how much to think about, but obviously something is on his mind. But let me mention a few things. Okay. The generations of free labor when cotton was king and cotton exports were our nation's #1 industry. The refusal of employment and or of promotions and raises for centuries. The loss of inheritance and deprivation of property. The failure to keep records of Social Security. What do you call Social Security? Call it Social Security?
Social insurance.
Social insurance.
Social insurance. I mean, I know people now, I know elderly people now who worked, maybe picked cotton in Mississippi, and no records were ever kept. So there is no retirement, even though they worked for years. No development of our neighborhoods. My grandmother's neighborhood in North Carolina, Fayetteville, North Carolina, there was a dividing line, the railroad tracks. And even though everybody paid taxes, on my grandmother's side of town, there were no paved roads, no sidewalks, no street lights, no running water, even though everybody paid the same taxes. Redlining, overcharging for insurance is what that is. Exclusion from educational opportunities, including state universities. The loss of income due to false convictions in racist courts with all white juries. The loss of income due to obscene rates of incarceration. The loss of life or health due to deprivation of medical care because of non-admission to hospitals. Psychological damage, and this may be the worst one. The psychological damage through terrorism. Yeah. Should I explain that? But, yeah, because
trigger word nowadays. That's a trigger word.
That's a trigger word. But my family, my parents grew up with terrorism. They grew up with their churches being burned down, with with bullets going through their windows, and everybody we were talking about in the Deep South, so that everybody would stay in their place. And maybe the worst thing is the rape of our mothers and our sisters. The etymology of the term, think about this, the etymology of the term motherfucker comes from slaves who could not call this man their father, but he did sire them. So how much does America owe my people? were the Almighty to adjudicate, then the ruling could be that along with Native Americans, that African Americans are actually the rightful owners of the United States of America, with all of its glory from sea to shining sea. And then someone would say, well, you should just forgive. Well, why don't we tell China to forgive us for the debt there? Our response, though, as African Americans and African American Christians in particular, will be one of composure and of empathy, and we learn not to take insult personally, but to actually have compassion on the people who don't understand. We have compassion on the people who are really, they're ignorant, they don't know. We are identifying with Jesus in this because that's what Christianity is. That's what being a Christian is. And we trust that God is righteous, that God is just, and that He will work for us, never discounting the importance of the fact that He will work through us. But He's not only going to work through us as African descent people, but He will work through many people from many backgrounds. Just like I talked to you earlier about the solidarity that we're experiencing with people from all kinds of backgrounds. This is what the kingdom of God looks like. The kingdom of God looks more like that than it does, in most cases, our churches. So I still believe that we shall overcome.
Can you just clarify? Like you because not everybody was here last night. Describe the community that you're talking about that looks more like the kingdom of God.
Yeah. It's interesting. I should have actually. I could have shown. Can you disconnect? Well, I don't know if I have to disconnect. Yeah. Can you disconnect that? I'll talk while I want to pull up a photograph. You can? Yeah, I can do that.
You're asking the wrong person. I'm okay.
Just unplug everything and bring it up here so I can
okay.
talk.
I can do that.
So, okay. Thank you. All right. Okay, so I think maybe. Okay, so we are the Bible calls the people of God a priesthood, a royal priesthood. Now, the only reason you need a priesthood is because there are people who need to be loved and prayed for. And so if the church, if there are some people who are the priesthood, it means that we are the advocates for the rest of the human race. And the reason that I am not going to be able to do this is that I don't know the password. I just need to... Somebody want to type in a password? Okay. It says SSUNet requires a WPA2 password. Okay.
We would share it with you, Dave.
Let's see.
It's just complicated.
It's on. It's on.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So I
Is it working?
got it. Okay. Everybody chill? Everybody's okay?
I'm feeling bad because I got you off track. You were saying something very wonderful.
Well, no, this is a part of it. This is... Oh yeah, I was. I don't remember what it was.
Hopefully you follow the test tomorrow.
There's a test.
Okay. All right. Here we go. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of you have seen this photo because at one point it's one of the photos that has been...
You want back on the projector?
Yeah, I want it back up now. Okay. Okay, let's see here. Okay, let me. Okay, so this is. I don't know how to make it so it's big enough. This is big enough. This actually I used this as a Facebook timeline picture a few months ago. I'm sure everything will come back on. All right. And we don't need audio anymore, so that's over. Okay, that's not on.
You just drag them.
Can you, yeah, maybe if you drag that down. Maybe if you drag that down and up here. There it is. Okay. Okay. So you can see a part of the picture anyway. Can you roll it up just a little bit? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So this was somewhere at the beginning of the year, and mostly college students. And someone asked me later, "Well, what were you doing out there?" And I said, "That's my new church. That's my new congregation." Because we resonated so completely. And when the hands that are being raised right now is because look behind and you see those are the police, right? Now the reason the police are there is because when we were marching, we had marched for a couple of hours by then, and we were going to the police station, and so that's when they came and blocked that part. And so they're standing back there, and I asked, how many people here have ever been harassed by someone from the Santa Barbara Police Department? And that's what those hands are. But I felt like their father, right? I felt like their father because I was so empowered to stand right there with them right behind me. They're not my enemies, but the light needs to be shining in our community. So I felt empowered to be able to empower them, to look out to mostly younger people and just give them that moment in the presence of the police. Now, as I said before, last night I said the police, this is not a blue problem, this is a green problem. And I have met with our chief of police, I've talked with them, I try to engage, but this is a systemic problem. And sometimes chiefs don't have control over what's going on. All right? Let me give you an example. Some of you know that I pastor churches in 2 communities. In the community 40 miles from this, where my other congregation is, in Oxnard, the chief of police is an African American woman. Yeah. Yeah. Can you imagine the testosterone she has to deal with every day? So but here's the thing, she's also an ordained Methodist minister, and I invited her to come preach at our church in Santa Barbara, where this is. And she opened by telling this story. Her son Al, her name is Jerry Williams, her son Al was the #1 basketball player at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's like 6'9", super athletic guy. And he just graduated last June. But this is the story she said. She said, one day, Al, my son, he was 20 years old at the time, called me in tears because for the 6th time he had been pulled over by the same officer in Santa Barbara. And she was livid. She called the chief of police and the harassment ended, but then she said, but what about all the kids who don't have a chief of police for a mother? Yeah.
No laws against that?
Well, let me tell you, there are laws against it, but they are practically unenforceable, rarely enforced. I mean, there's the way the system supports itself against the people and in defense of law enforcement. And especially in our city, which is a very wealthy city, it's like the police work for the rich people. Yeah, that's why they're there. All right, so I want to close with this last slide. If we can go back to PowerPoint.
Wait, why did you say they're there?
Well, the people who benefit the most from their presence is the wealthy people, the businesses, but for the ordinary people, it's a liability in many cases. Now I'm speaking in binary terms, and it's not completely that way all the time. And like I said last night, there are times when I recognize I may need the police and I will not hesitate to call. But there's always something in the back of my mind. There's always a question. All right, so can we go down to Matthew 5? And this is what I'm going to conclude with. It's the next, maybe right after that. Okay, and this is what I want to say to us. We are the people that we've been waiting for, right? That's the thing I want to close with emphatically. Now, this is, okay, let's look at these verses. Matthew 5. And seeing the multitudes, he went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. Then he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Or blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice. Verse 7, Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now I want you to please notice this. Jesus sees the multitudes, but he's not addressing the multitudes. He sees the multitudes and he takes his disciples apart. The multitudes are his visual, his object lesson. And he's convincing his disciples that these people, these bedraggled, forlorn people are blessed. These people who have no refuge, nowhere to go, no one to talk to, and no recourse, they are the ones who are blessed. And this is the image that he wants to seal in the minds of his disciples. That every kind of evidence that you could pull up would indicate that they're not blessed, that God is against him. And in fact, religion up at this point, as you've understood it, might say that God is not with them, that God is against them. But I'm reversing this, because I want you to understand God in a whole different way. I want you to see God as being their supporter, their advocate, in their corner, fighting for them, standing up for them, even dying for them. And so he says, you know what? Yeah, they're poor, but they're blessed. They're mourning, but they're blessed. They're desperately longing for justice, but they're blessed. They're meek, but they're blessed, and they're going to inherit the earth. But then, look what happens next. What verse did we get to? Verse 11. All right? Now, before it was they're blessed, but then he's directing it to them. Verse 11. Blessed are you. He's talking directly to the disciples now. When they revile and persecute you and they say all kinds of evil against you for my sake, rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So Jesus wants them to be clear that you are to identify with them, and that's where your reward is. When you choose to be one of them by being their mouthpiece, it will cost you to do that. It will cost you. You will be reviled and persecuted. But you know what? Just like they're blessed, you are blessed. Because this is the way the kingdom of God works. So, even though it seems like you're at the bottom, rejoice anyway. And be exceedingly glad anyway, because this is what the kingdom of God looks like. There is an inevitability that is divine, and nobody can keep this from happening. But you have to have the vision for it in order for it to become reality. So I want to encourage you to, as I said last night, go for it. And your younger people, particularly, go for it. Stand up for people. Speak up for people. Even if you have to get out on the streets to do it. So, any remarks? 'Cause that's what I have. Yeah.
I just found it interesting, the Latin meaning of compassion is to suffer with, patitum. And I think that we talk about compassion, we don't often understand it as being an incarnational lifestyle. Suffering with those on the right and on the left, and taking on their burdens, you know. That is the only meaning.
Lovely. Well,
Was it a coincidence? Were you aware that a few times in the last 20 minutes you said this is what the kingdom of God looks like? Sounded like the same rhythm of the chant. This is what democracy looks like.
I had no.
It came,
Did I really?
said at least twice with the same
This is
kind of
what the
rhythm.
kingdom of God looks like. Oh, wow. Okay. Cool. Well, I guess unless somebody else has some observation, we're done, right?
Well, I'd just
Rebecca?
like to make one comment. You're talking all about the persecution of the black Americans, which leads them. I mean, in today's world, to me, there's no excuse for people not understanding at least some of the history with all the movies and books that's been shown lately. Just to mull through the movies, and I know that sometimes Hollywood doesn't get it right, but at the same time, there is a lot of accuracy in some of those movies and a lot of those books. So people really should have a pretty good sense now of some of the things that...
You know, I'm as perplexed as you are as to why we still drag our feet, but still have hope. Yeah, Rebecca?
No, I just wanted to get up and say thank you everyone for coming and participating in this. I think there's been some really great discussions come out of it, but mostly to say thank you to David Moore for coming all this way and sharing his perspective and bringing part of his world to all of us here in Charlotte County. And I just think we're really fortunate to have that possibility. So thank you.